Hi everyone, Matt from Moffat Library coming to you in pre-recorded form. If you were not familiar, we did give a presentation on this back in May of 2020, but we decided to redo it again as a pre-recorded program that you could access anytime. And the reason why we decided to do this now is because the theme for the 2020 summer reading program is Imagine Your Story. And within miniature wargaming, there are elements of storytelling and narrative, development. So we thought this was appropriate to kind of tie into that. I'll also say that this is a autobiographical program in a way. It's a hobby that I've had since I was 12 years old. I'm much older than that now, and during the initial few weeks or so of you know March of 2020, when at least locally in our area, people were sheltering in place, limiting their unnecessary trips to the store. Um, a lot of people were trying to find things to do, and one of the things that I turned to during those times was a hobby that I had for many years, and that was miniature wargaming and model soldiers. So I use that as a way to help me cope with some stress, anxiety, maybe some things that were happening in the outside world that I couldn't quite comprehend or control. And it was just a really nice experience to kind of get back in touch with this hobby that I've enjoyed so much. And I hope that my experiences with the hobby can maybe inspire some other people that might be interested in picking it up for themselves. And whether you are a history buff or you enjoy fantasy literature or science fiction movies, this hobby has something in it for everybody to kind of get involved with. And even during something as traumatic and as a pandemic, there are ways that you can socially interact with people through this hobby that doesn't require you to be in the same room with them. And in many cases, this has been the case with me even before this, where I couldn't really find a gaming store or a community that I could join that, like a club, that gamed on a regular basis that I could actually attend. So this might give you some options and alternatives and inspirations, maybe form your own clubs or to be able to meet virtually. And again, like I said, we'll get into that in a little bit. So when people ask me what wargaming is, I usually tell them that it's a mix between chess and Dungeons and Dragons, right? So in chess, it's a strategy game that involves you moving pawns across a grid, and the object is to outwit your opponent and defeat them. In Dungeons and Dragons, there is, of course, the goals of being able to defeat your enemy, but instead of using pawns, you're actually using models that represent characters, whether they're dragons or knights or wizards or monsters. Those pawns have personalities, to be a little bit of use some alliteration there, and there's a story behind it, right? So you're trying to find a chest of gold in a dungeon, or you're trying to slay a dragon. So there's that story arc there. In miniature wargaming, yes, you are moving soldiers like pawns on a chessboard or a checkers board, but those soldiers have personalities too. A soldier that might not be as experienced as a veteran might choose to run away, or you might be playing a role of a commander that only does certain things because that's their personality. So in many respects, uh, the uh, the hobby of wargaming ties those two things together. You have strategy and you have storytelling, and together, when you are playing with the right group of people, it really is a fun and enjoyable experience, and also competitive to a degree as well. Now, this isn't going to be a history of wargaming talk, so I'm going to gloss over some things that maybe other people who are watching this that might know a little bit more about me might say, "Oh, you missed out on this author or this or other, um, you know, watershed moment in wargaming history, but I figured it would be best to kind of hit some high notes, at least that I found important. Um, I do recommend reading the Wargaming Compendium by Henry Hyde. It's a wonderful book. Our library actually has a copy of this, so you're welcome to check it out next time you stop by the library, or you can put a hold on it and we can interlibrary loan it to you. So, wargaming has been around since there were model soldiers and toy soldiers specifically, and that is a very, very long time. A lot of early model soldiers have been found in Egypt and in Iraq that date back to thousands of years. By the 17th and 18th century, you start to see lead soldiers called zinni They are basically two-dimensional painted pieces of metal, molded into the shapes of knights and soldiers of that time period. And these are some examples of some 2D flat miniatures from the early 20th century. And for the most part, they were just toys. They were not meant for competitive gaming or playing with other people. They were really meant as to be toys for the upper classes. Although, as the centuries wore on, by I want to say uh, the mid to late 18th century, early 19th century, you start to see model soldiers like these being used by officers who are being trained to lead actual soldiers in combat. So very much academically used, and they could only be obtained by the wealthy in European society. In the late 19th, early 20th century, a company by the name of Britons comes about, and Britain's toy soldiers are very well known throughout the world. If you're not familiar with the company, you've probably seen at least a few of their red-coated British soldiers somewhere in your attic, and either as plastic or metal. And essentially, Britain's was able to mass produce hollow cast metal soldiers for mainly upper middle class children growing up in Victorian Britain. And the thing that made them unique was that they were four-dimensional. So instead of the two-dimensional flat figures from the previous slides, you actually have more detail in these. And they came in different poses. On top of that, they were very, because Britain's was and is a British company, at the time that they were producing their soldiers, it was the height of what was known as the British Empire. So you didn't just see British troops; you also saw troops from their Commonwealth colonies, from the Commonwealth or their colonies overseas. So again, this included troops from India, troops that served in Canada, troops that were in Africa. So they were very collectible, and again, but to a very specific class of people. And in some degrees, they were still just toys. There was no real game element used with them. In 1913, a gentleman by the name of H.G. Wells, you might recognize him as the author of The War of the Worlds, among many other works of popular science fiction, published a set of rules called Little Wars, which is considered the first rule book for gaming with model soldiers. Now, his rules did use a lot of elements that are used in rules today, such as using measuring tape and dice to calculate distance and as well as troop movement. There are also elements of it that you don't see in a lot of war games today. For example, the cannons that were used in this game were spring-loaded, and if you decided to fire on your opponent's troops, you would shoot basically metal BBs at them to knock them over. Something that you don't see at a lot of wargaming conventions today for obvious reasons, but there is that element of play there and whimsy that you do see in a lot of war games today. I will note though that again, it still is, you see the types of people playing this game. They're upper middle class or upper class English gentlemen. It's not a terribly kid friendly game at this point, but that will change over time. In post World War II Europe, you begin to see an explosion of uh, basically wargaming publications and what I call the democratization of the hobby. You first start to see a lot of manufacturers like Airfix and Revell producing plastic mold injected soldiers that could be purchased by school children of various social classes to be painted and to be played with. Uh, so if you couldn't afford the metal, highly detailed metal Britain's toy soldiers, don't worry. There were toy soldiers that were made out of plastic that were more affordable for you. And you also start to see a lot of literature being produced. One of the biggest authors of this time period was Donald Featherstone. He authored over 40 works of literature related to wargaming. He also was involved in starting the first gaming convention in the UK around 1960. The same year that this book, Battle Notes for Wargamers, came out in 1974, something else happens called Dungeons and Dragons. And as I mentioned earlier, Dungeons and Dragons isn't necessarily a war game because you're basically moving specific characters around a map. But again, the storytelling of Dungeons and Dragons really kind of helped make models, turn models into actual living, breathing things. And if you had somebody who was a really good storyteller in Dungeons and Dragons, your dungeon master or your game master, it could really turn a basic, tabletop war game into a whole narrative experience. If you let your mind and your imagination kind of grow on you. And you see a lot of the elements of Dungeons and Dragons being used in modern day wargaming rules and scenario books as well. Again, you're not just Napoleon fighting the Battle of Waterloo. You're Napoleon, and this is how you feel, and this is what's going on in the battlefield right now, and this is how your troops are going to react to it. A lot of that ties into Dungeons and Dragons as well. In the 1980s, something called Warhammer happens, and Warhammer basically combined the massive troops and large scale battles that were being depicted in Donald Featherstone's books with the storytelling elements of Dungeons and Dragons to create a rule set for mass combat with fantasy armies. And the designers of and creators of Warhammer were inspired by the works of J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings trilogy, as well as Michael Moorcock, who is another very well-known British science fiction and fantasy author. And they created this world where you have monsters called orcs, and you have creatures like high elves and dark elves and humans coexisting and fighting each other. And each group of each race within this game has their own narrative story, and this was something that was it was basically taken and became very popular, and the models themselves were very became iconic within the community. And currently, Warhammer is in its 8th or 9th edition, and it's spawned numerous spin-offs, including Warhammer 40K, which is essentially the universe of Warhammer Fantasy, but set 40,000 years in the future. There are video games that are based off of Warhammer. There's a whole series of paperback books that kind of introduce you into the world. And it's a game that's still being played at conventions and at competitions to this day. The authors of Warhammer still work in the industry, and a lot of them have gone on to write other rule sets for historical gaming, as well as other fantasy and science fiction gaming as well. So the creators of Warhammer are very prolific in and of themselves, and have inspired a whole new generation of gamers as a result. This is actually my personal copy of the 5th edition rulebook, and it's one of the reasons why I got into the hobby in the first place. So how do you get started exactly? Well, you have to think about what inspires you, because you could go out and you could say I'm going to find a hobby, but finding a hobby and acting like that kind of turns it into work, and you don't want this to be work. You want it to be fun. So you have to think about what would get you into the hobby in the first place, and maybe what will keep you here for a long period of time. And so you have to think about, what TV shows do you watch, what movies do you enjoy, what books do you read, um, video games that you play. A lot of war games are based on these things, and vice versa, right? So when miniseries such as Band of Brothers in the Pacific came out, World War II gaming became very popular, and and it was popular before that, but again, it saw a surge of new, younger, you know, participants as a result. Um, I mentioned, J.R.R. Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings. You also have, the Game of Thrones series by George R.R. Martin. That has been turned into a tabletop war game. As well as, maybe books that aren't necessarily related to wargaming, but could be, for example, mystery or pulp books that involve characters that are similar to Indiana Jones, solving mysteries or going on adventures. There's some war games that actually use those elements in them. Video games such as Call of Duty, um, or even have helped kind of inspire more modern wargaming. You also have other war games that have inspired video games, like Warhammer has been turned into a video game, and then you also have some video games that have been turned into tabletop RPGs or war games such as Fallout, which is the most recent example that I can remember. Um, do you like history? Historical gaming basically spans the beginning of time to basically cavemen throwing sticks and rocks at each other, or hunting woolly mammoths, all the way up to what you've been reading in the news last week or even yesterday. Um, there are plenty of historical war games to get involved with, a wide variety of miniatures. Think about what time periods interest you. Maybe there's a certain character like Joan of Arc that you might find appealing, that you would want to play as, or maybe play in that time period. Or like I said, maybe you would want to be George Washington and you would want to refight the American Revolutionary War, or be, General Cornwallis, and see if you could actually beat the Americans and stop the colonies from becoming the United States. That might be something that might appeal to you. And then finally, miniatures. A lot of gamers will talk about a pile of lead or a pile of plastic in their closet someplace, from all the miniatures that they've bought and never painted. And it's a joke, but and to some degree there's truth there, because the sculpting and the artistry in the miniatures, whether they be plastic, metal, or paper, is appealing, and it's something that is really fun to do as a hobby itself, just painting them and assembling them. This picture on the right is from a series of miniatures called The War in Christmas Village by Jackalope Miniatures, and these are not mine. These were painted for the company. This is from their website, but I looked at this and I said I really wanted to buy these, because they're miniatures that are set to the scale of the Christmas village that you might see at your local craft store, at your parents' house or your grandparents' house. And you could use the buildings that you see in those Christmas villages as terrain. And basically you exist in this environment where there are zombie elves and mutant gingerbread men, and you fight each other. And I just thought that was such a whimsical and fun idea that I had to get the miniatures. And currently I'm still working on painting them, but again, just an example of some of the things that might inspire you to get started in the hobby. These are some other miniatures that inspired me. I remember when I was, about 12 or 13 years old, I went to my local hobby store, and there was a magazine there on miniature wargaming, and I just kind of flipped through it, and I saw on the back cover there were these soldiers that were very brightly painted, lots of lace and details. They also had these massive flags, and I didn't really know what time period um, they depicted, but I just thought they looked really cool, and I wanted to paint them. And I later learned out that they were from a period called the Marlburian period. It's basically a period between the 1600s and the early 1700s where warfare changed, and it's named after the Duke of Marlborough, who is the ancestor of Winston Churchill, and he was considered one of Britain's most famous and successful generals. And so this is a period that I still paint and I game with frequently, just because I just enjoy it. I'm also a Revolutionary War reenactor, so again, the American Revolution is a time period that I'm pretty well versed in describing to people, or so a topic that I'm very interested in myself. So not many of my friends or people that I might want to get into gaming might not really be interested in the previous time period that I talked about, but if I mention the American Revolutionary War, well, then they might be interested in that because it's something that they grew up with. So that's another period that I also game as well. I also like to hike and travel, and if you have other hobbies like these, that might tie into maybe you're interested in wargaming as well. Um, on the left is Fort Montgomery State Historic Site in the Hudson Valley, New York. Um, it was a site of a battle fought in October 1777, where the British Army basically snuck up on the Americans at Forts Montgomery and Clinton on the Hudson River and destroyed both of them overnight, and sailed all the way up to Kingston, which was the capital of New York, and burned that to the ground. But today, violence aside, it is a very lovely park, lots of really great nature trails. It's one of my favorite places to visit. And so I really feel like I'm in tune with the history there. And and again, wargaming that time period really takes me back into, my hikes and being able to stand on the battlefield and understand the terrain and how the soldiers would have reacted to a certain situation on the spot where you're standing is a really unique experience. The picture on the right is from a trip I took to Canada a year or two ago, and this is the Isaac Brock Monument at Queenston Heights Park in Ontario, Canada. And this was where, in 1812, the American Army basically sailed across the Niagara River to invade Canada during the War of 1812. And again, it helped inspire a current project that I'm working on right now, because again, every model that I paint or battle that I research for the War of 1812 reminds me of the great experiences that I had on that vacation, and it makes me want to go back there again. So those are some other things that might inspire you um, in getting involved in wargaming. But there's also some research. Whether you're learning how to paint a TIE fighter, or you're trying to figure out the color of a gun carriage that was used by the Prussian army in the 1750s, or if you are trying to recreate a specific army, you do have to do a little bit of research because you want to know what types of troops you're going to be leading into battle. There are a lot of different publishers and types of books out there if you're interested in learning more about a specific time period or genre, especially if it's anything related to historical gaming. These are just a few of the books that I use. I've used actually now or in the past. On the upper left-hand corner is a book by Osprey Publishing, The United States Army, 1812 to 1815. Osprey is a very basically has published many works of literature related to military uniforms and equipment over the years, and again, they're very prolific. There is not one war gamer or history buff I know that does not have at least one of these books on their shelves or had one of these books on their shelves growing up. It's very good for basic information, and the authorship on some of them is excellent. And again, for just the illustrations alone, they're just a wonderful resource. A newer publisher, the one on the lower left, the Armies and Wars of the Sun King, is by Hellion and Company. They publish, again, similar to Osprey, mainly books on military uniforms and equipment and tactics, but they're more, I would say they're more like expanded editions. So you're not just getting the uniforms and the organization of the army, you're also learning about the colonels of the various regiments that served, maybe some biographical information on the generals, and some context into the time period in general. The um, the book on the bottom middle, From Pike to Shot, 1685 to 1720, is by Charles Stewart Grant, and that book is no longer in print. But I just threw that on there because it's from a publisher known as the Wargames Research Group, which was one of the first publishers to actually write history books for the wargaming hobby. And again, the book is pretty old, but I still keep it around just as a really fun resource to flip through, and it does provide scenarios in the back of the book if you did want to game the period. There are also regular nonfiction books as well. So, A Very Brilliant Affair by Robert Malcolmson is a book about the Battle of Queenston Heights written by a Canadian historian. It's very well researched and also entertaining to read. Under the Black Flag is by David Cordingley. I'm really interested in pirate history. That's another time period that I find fascinating. And again, it's just a wonderful read if you're interested in learning about the romance of piracy and kind of where the romance and the reality, kind of splits. And then the final book is The Art and Warfare in the Age of Marlborough by David Chandler. He was one of the preeminent historians of basically the Napoleonic and early 18th century time periods. The book is still in print, and it's a little bit dry for maybe people who are just getting stuck into the time period. But again, I put that there as an example of a military history book that has a lot of detailed information in it that some people might find would be useful if they were researching an army. There are also rule books. So these are some of the ones that I've used in the past. The war games come in a variety of different shapes and sizes. You could have rules for one-on-one combat where you only need one miniature per side, up to thousands of models on the table, and each rule book is a little bit different because that is the game itself. That's probably the most important part of wargaming outside of the models is what rules are you going to use to play with. So some rules like Flint and Feather and Blood and Plunder and On Guard and Donnybrook, those are all rule books that are geared towards skirmish battles, so battles that don't really need that many figures. And the interesting thing that I liked is in Flint and Feather, it's warfare between Native American tribal groups. Which is something that you don't really see a lot in wargaming literature, so it's a little bit different. There's a little bit of anthropology involved in this as well, so that kind of sets it apart. Blood and Plunder is warfare for in the age of piracy, using large models, so it's always kind of a showstopper when I game with that with some friends of mine at our local hobby store because it just looks so unique. And then Donnybrook and On Guard take place during the 1600s, and it's mainly fighting in the Age of the Three Musketeers, which is, again, if you're familiar with the works of Alexander Dumas or even the movies that have come out inspired by, that's a really fun time period to game as well. And then Black Powder and A Gentleman's War are two books that use that are rules geared towards gaming with large numbers of model soldiers. And A Gentleman's War is interesting in that it's actually a throwback to the H.G. Wells Little Wars book, in that you're encouraged to use toy soldiers or soldiers that are more whimsical looking than modern than realistic. So it kind of harkens back to the early days of wargaming. There are also forums. The Wargames website is a great one. It provides news, reviews, and updates on upcoming games, models, Kickstarters, conventions, you name it. I really enjoy going to their website and just kind of following along. The On Tabletop, formerly Beasts of War, is another really great resource. I was introduced to this through YouTube. They have a weekly YouTube show. It's about an hour and a half long, where they discuss again different elements of the hobby. They'll do let's plays. They'll do reviews of models. So before you decide to invest in a game or a time period, they might have a YouTube video archived, and you could watch through and see if it's a game for you. It's also very entertaining. It's geared more towards adults, but again, the community is very friendly and welcoming. They have a Discord right now where you could actually interact with other gamers. They also have an interactive website where you could see what other people are working on. And then Daka Daka is a forum geared towards the Warhammer community. So like the first two, but it's focused on a specific game. And that said, I do like, although I don't play Warhammer myself, I really enjoy kind of flipping through the forums and seeing what people are doing with their miniatures, because there's a lot of very talented people out there that will actually customize their figures and make them unique works of art. And Daka Daka is a really great forum for that. And it's an interesting look at kind of a specific game subculture within the hobby too. So after rules, you need figures. So metal, plastic, or paper, what are you going to choose? Metal figures have been around. Like I said, they've been around probably for the longest period of time, outside of maybe wooden or clay or composite figures. They are highly detailed, and they're durable. These are some French figures for Blood and Plunder that I painted. Again, they paint up really well. The one thing with metal miniatures, depending on the manufacturer and the scale, is they could be kind of expensive and also heavy if you're going to be carrying them to a convention or a game. So you have to kind of keep that in mind to price and how much space do you have to store them. These are some plastic figures that I painted as German Landsknechts, basically Renaissance mercenaries. Not the best paint job in my opinion, but again, kind of gives you an example of at least plastic models. So plastic miniatures have been around since the 1950s, 1960s. They're inexpensive. They come in a wide variety of poses and styles. Most war games being produced today, or miniatures being produced today, are coming out are being produced in plastic, just because it's fairly inexpensive. You also have 3D printing now, which allows you to basically download a file and print out as many figures as you possibly want. That being said, they're fairly lightweight, which makes them lack something called heft, which is what a lot of gamers, or I should say some gamers, like, which is the feeling of basically the weightiness of the model, which is to me superficial. But if that's something that's important to you, you might want to look at a metal figure. Another thing too is that in some cases they do require a little bit of work when it comes to painting them. Some details might not show as good as on metal, but at the same time, newer plastic figures are being produced that are highly detailed and rival, and if not surpass a lot of metal models also on the market. And finally, there's paper. And paper miniatures have actually they've been around since the late 19th century as well, maybe even a little bit earlier. And although they haven't really been used in wargaming a lot, an artist by the name of Peter Dennis, who has worked for Osprey Publishing and has done and is a phenomenal military illustrator, has started producing his own paper miniatures called the Paper Boys. And basically, the whole premise is that you buy a book of model soldiers that you could photocopy and print, and then cut out as many as you want to just to play a game. And these figures come with their own terrain. They also come with their own rules. They're available through Hellion and Company. He also has them on his website, peterspaperboys.com, and I have a link to that at the end of the presentation as well. And here you can see a couple of them cut out and assembled, still waiting for their glue to dry. They could be a little fiddly, so I would say not the best for little hands or people who might be afraid of cutting off a head or two of a model. But again, when you put them all together, they look really great, and these are starting to be used more, or I'm starting to see these at a lot of game shows, or at least on Facebook, people actually playing games with them. So next, we have to pick a scale, and there are a lot of scales to choose from. And we're basically going to go from the smallest to the largest. I will say that this is going to miss a few scales. For example, the smallest scale that you could game with that I've seen is 2 millimeter. There's also 3 millimeter and 6 millimeter. We're going to start with 10 millimeter, which is on the far left-hand side. There's also 18 millimeter and then 40 millimeter as well. But again, this is going to give you a good idea of generally what a lot of gamers use to game with. So starting off, we have a 10 millimeter scale. You could this is a regiment of Continental Line infantry from Pendraken Miniatures, and the nice thing with 10 millimeter is that if you're looking for recreating large battles with lots and lots of soldiers, roughly almost on a 1 to 10 scale or even a 1 to 1 scale, 10 millimeter is a wonderful, cost-effective way to do this. Most of them are produced in metal as well, so if you like metal figures and the feel of them, again, this gives you that option too. However, they're not terribly well detailed, so you're not going to really get all the facial features and expressions that you might get from a figure in the larger scale. But again, the whole point is that you're fielding a huge army on a small table, and you can't do that with the larger figures unless you have an entire basement or a room dedicated to wargaming. Next up is 15 millimeter, and 15 millimeter has been around for a while. It's probably one of the more common scales that is used by gamers in the hobby. And you can see, unlike the previous slide, you see faces, you see buttons on the coats, you might see some straps and grime on the uniforms. So again, just a slightly larger than the 10 millimeter figures, but a little bit more detailed. Then there's 25 millimeter, and 25 millimeter. Again, there's even more detail. You're starting to see eyes and specific facial features too. You're seeing lace around the buttonholes. So again, they're a little bit more expressive, but also you're not seeing as many models per regiment with these guys, and that's because really you could, for me to put on a game with these types of soldiers, again, I would need a large space for that, which I don't have. And they're also a little bit more expensive than the 10 millimeter figures as well. Then there's 28 millimeter, and 28 millimeter is what I use with Blood and Plunder. So these are all Firelock games, Carib native peoples, and again, the details on them are phenomenal. If you're comparing these with the previous figures, you actually can see now tattoos, and you could see the different colored, feathers in their headdresses, um, and the expressions on them are really, highly animated as well. And then finally, there's 54 millimeter. 54 millimeter isn't used with gamers frequently. However, you do see a few games which will show later on using these soldiers, and 54 millimeter is what people like H.G. Wells were using when they first started wargaming back in the early 1900s. Traditional toy soldiers, so they can be expensive, others not so much, and they do take up a lot of table space. So you have to kind of figure out where do you want to use them. And in some cases, you could use them on the floor, or you could play with them outside. And this is just an example of, two extremes of the spectrum. So on the right is the 10 millimeter figures, and on the left is the 54 millimeter. And you could see the the sharp contrast in the type and style and detail of the models. Next, you have to assemble your army. And for that, you'll need supplies. You'll need brushes. Usually brushes come in synthetic or sable. Sable is a hairbrush. You could pick them up at your local hobby or craft store fairly inexpensively. Usually double zero is de rigueur for most painting. However, there are different types of brushes and sizes depending on the size of the miniature that you're painting and how much detail you want. There are also a wide variety of paints to choose from. Citadel, Privateer Press, and then Army Painter are three different companies. There's also Vallejo. This is just, a general, and the picture that I'm showing here is just of one type of paint manufacturer, but there are plenty to choose from, and you're going to have to decide which colors you like to paint your figures with, and how well the colors come out on the model. And you also would need, and paints come in different types. So you have a base paint, which is a dark color, and then a layer paint, which is a slightly lighter color, and then a highlight, which is the brightest color that you can get. And if you have three of those different shades of colors to paint your miniatures, you could really make a very dynamic and complete looking and realistic looking model. You also have thinners and finishes. So thinners to make the paint last a little bit longer, or to make it more translucent, and then finishes such as a clear coat to protect the miniature from being cracked, or from the paint from chipping if you drop it, which tends to happen. You also might need glue. Some figures do require assembly. Epoxy or green stuff is a putty. You see an example of that on the lower right-hand side, that you can knead together to fill in gaps in the model figure, or to create weapons or custom pieces that you could use with your army. And then basing material like washers or pennies works. Grass, fake like railroad grass, as an example, just to give the miniature some place to stand without tipping over and make it look like it's part of the environment. And then a wet palette, which is what you use to keep your paints wet and mix them on. Your workstation should be well lit, comfy. You should have ample room for movement, and mostly well organized. So again, you want to have you're going to be sitting and painting for maybe several hours or so. You want to be able to have a nice chair for that. You also want to have enough light. Again, this isn't a great example of that, but don't worry, there is a light in that room. So you could get proper color coordination, and you also want to have it organized so that you know where all your paints are, and if you're working on multiple projects at the same time, it could get confusing really fast. Finally, some games figured to show you the finished products. Uh, some games could be very big. This is a refight of the Battle of Yorktown from 1781. This was from NJCon, which is a New Jersey gaming convention from a few years ago, and this game had about 800 miniatures on the table. They were 25 millimeters, so they were pretty big. And again, this is all basically one or two people's personal collections. So it's to see them all on the table like this was really amazing, and the game was a lot of fun. It was four versus four, so that kind of gives you a sense of how many people were involved in playing. Other games can be very small. This is a game called Gangs of Rome, which takes place during the ancient Roman times and involves not armies, but really people who are criminals or gang members and basically trying to outwit each other and basically accomplish crimes in ancient Rome. And you could see that this game doesn't have a lot of terrain. It has a little mat that you could put it on that's pre-textured, and only a few models to a side. So again, like D&D, there's a lot of storytelling in this game, and that kind of creates the environment in which your characters live and interact with each other. Other games don't require a lot of terrain at all. This is a refight of the trench run from Star Wars Episode 4: New Hope, where Luke Skywalker attempts to blow up the Death Star. And if you're a Star Wars fan, or even if you're just familiar with the movie, this is a pretty iconic scene. And you see that this is just achieved by using some pieces of printed cardboard and some models. And this is using a game system called Star Wars X-Wing. And basically it involves pre-painted miniatures, and so it's, if you don't like to paint, this is a great game to get involved with. And if you have friends who are really interested in Star Wars or enjoy the movies, very easy to get them interested in it as well. And then this is that Flint and Feather game I had mentioned before. So you're basically in charge of a small war band of native warriors, and there are elements of, again, storytelling, magic, anthropology involved in this, in the way that each of the individual models interacts with each other. It's a very interesting experience, and one I've really enjoyed. And again, doesn't really require that many models or a large space to play them on. This is that Little Wars game, not Little Wars, a Gentleman's War game, and you could see that again, the soldiers in this slide are similar to the ones that H.G. Wells would have played with in his initial Little Wars rules. And again, a lot of fun to play this. There are characters that interact with you that could change the course of the game. Outcome of the game. And it's really a very light-hearted, and fun game to play. But again, using large toy soldiers, and you need a decent amount of table space to play it on. This is Blood and Plunder, so that pirate game I mentioned before. And Blood and Plunder can be played on land. It could also be played at sea. And so we have some ship combat happening here between an English ship and a Spanish ship, and they're fighting in the Caribbean at this present time. And again, the models in the boats all have to be painted and assembled. So something for you to consider if you're interested in gaming. But this is one of my favorite games to play. Those 54 millimeter figures I talked about before. Again, I mentioned they could be played outside. There is something called garden wargaming, where you can take your troops out into the backyard and you use the natural environment as terrain, and you could game with them outside. You could also game with them inside, but again, it takes a lot of space to actually play with them on. The picture on the right is from NJCon from a few years ago, and this is a refight of the Battle of Borodino using 54 millimeter toy soldiers, and this is only half of the table. The other half was actually behind me, but I could only get this far out if I to get enough detail for the figures and to get the sense of the scale of the setup. But this required at least 8 to 10 card tables to play on. And then, but you could also have a small table and have a lot of miniatures on it too. This is a late medieval battle fought at a friend's house, and again, this was a 2-on-2 medieval siege. And again, a lot of miniatures on the table, but you didn't need a lot of space to use them on because they're not going to be moving around a whole lot. And then finally, this is Gnome Wars. And Gnome Wars is a whimsical fantasy game. It takes place in an alternate universe where there are different gnome countries that are at war with each other, and kind of set against the backdrop of roughly World War I, we would consider. And so this is an Irish gnome army invading a castle using a rainbow bridge, because, why not? And this was a fun game to play at Historicon a few years ago, which is another large wargaming convention. And this was a game that was popular with a lot of kids and their parents. There had to be at least 12 people playing this game at once, and everybody was just having a wonderful time. And again, I just wanted to show this too because wargaming is about warfare and it is about combat, but it can also be very silly and lighthearted and fun. And I think the emphasis on it being fun really will help a lot of people kind of get involved in the hobby and enjoy themselves. HMGS is a national organization dedicated to promoting historical miniature wargaming. They host what is considered the largest wargaming convention in the world every year in Pennsylvania called Historicon. They also host 2 other conventions in the spring and the fall: Cold Wars in the spring, and then Fallen in the fall. Highly recommend joining them or even checking out their website. They offer something called Hobby University, which is a series of classes that teaches you how to paint miniatures. You get advice from experts. It also has a wonderfully diverse community of people who are interested in all sorts of gaming, not just historical gaming. Fantasy and science fiction gamers are also welcome as well. And how do you enjoy the hobby solo though? And this was something that a lot of people were trying to figure out, or at least refigure out during the recent pandemic. So there are many large and small companies that do mail order delivery, which is nice. So you don't even need a hobby store in your area to purchase from. Although if you do have one, I highly recommend checking them out. And then you also have options for printing at home. You have 3D printed models. You also have paper ones, like I mentioned before. I had a friend of mine who was interested in the Peter Dennis paper miniatures, and he had bought the book, but he didn't have a printer. So I photocopied a bunch of miniatures for him to make himself. And after I mailed them to him, I said, well, you know what? I could maybe make another army, and by the time we're able to game together again, we could actually have a large battle if we wanted to. And then 3D printing has dropped in price. It's become very affordable, so you can even buy your own 3D printer and print out your own models and terrain. Take this time to learn how to paint or improve your painting skills. That's something that I enjoy doing personally. I actually like painting more than I do gaming, just because it's a nice Zen activity. I could put on a documentary or an audiobook or some music in the background that's relaxing, and I could sit and paint for hours if I want to. You could also plan a game project with friends. You could all paint together. You could all paint separately if you want to. So again, another way to kind of plan ahead and focus on maybe developing a game that is going to be really fun and worth the wait. Try solo gaming. Solo games have been around for a while, but again, with what's been going on right now, you see more people trying out solo games. So essentially, what that is gaming by yourself. Many rules actually have options for single player games. You could also use this as an opportunity to try out rules and become familiar with them before you introduce them to your gaming group. And you just have to not take a side and just enjoy the game for what it is. Online programs like Vassal and Tabletop Simulator are really great because you could actually roll dice virtually and move figures virtually, and you could interact with people online. And again, those they've also have add-ons that were developed by community members for playing Warhammer or Memoir 44 virtually, which are war games or board games that are inspired by war games online. So again, it's that feeling of I go, you go, or I'm going to go and you're going to go at the same time and roll some dice and we'll see what happens that you'll get at a normal gaming convention, but online. You could also host a virtual hobby night. If you have a Twitch or a Discord, you could start posting pictures of like, hey, this is what I'm working on, and you can have other people share. I've also experimented with doing Facebook Live and just filming myself painting, just to show people what I do. It's a lot of fun, some interaction there. But again, this is just a couple of examples of ways that you could enjoy the hobby by yourself if you don't have a group to game with yet, or if you're just you just can't be bothered with kind of going out and about at the present time. Other resources to consider: Junior General and Peter's Paperboys. Uh, these are really great resources for free paper miniatures. Although Peter's Paperboys, you do have to pay for those. The Junior General ones you don't have to. And Junior General is also run by a social studies teacher. So a lot of the scenarios and rules that are used with those figures on that website are geared towards a classroom setting. So if you wanted to teach a history class in a unique way, he has lesson plans on there. The gentleman's name is Matt Fritz, and he has lesson plans and tutorials on how to teach wargaming in the classroom. And then the Peter's Paperboys is the online home to Peter Dennis's miniatures. He does have some free stuff on there, but most of it you do have to pay for. Again, even if you just want to check out the artwork and see what the figures look like en masse, it's worth looking into. And then Rules and Terrain, you have free Wargames rules, and then you have the Wargame Vault. These are both resources that allow for free print and play miniature rules and terrain, or pay as you go. I'm sorry, pay what you want. Wargame Vault, you do have to pay for certain products like soldiers. You could actually buy from them paper models or 3D printed models. You could also buy printable terrain from them. But again, if you want to get into the hobby and not spend a lot of money or just try out a little bit of it, these are some fun links to check out. And just wanted to say thank you for watching and sitting through this. I hope that you've been inspired to take part in this hobby and maybe grow it, grow a community of your own. And hopefully one day we'll see you at a convention at some point, or maybe at a hobby night. Take care, and if you have any questions, please feel free to contact us, moffat@rcls.org. That's MOFFAT at rcls.org. And with the subject line Wargaming Info, and our staff will be happy to answer that for you. Thank you, and thank you for watching.